Hey there, it's Cassie. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to make a few cards using a couple of different background techniques. And I'm using similar colors but two different mediums to show you the difference. And in the end we'll have 4 cards. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different products that I'm using. The stamps that I'm going to be using today comes from My Favorite Things, and this is called Birthday Bears. I love those cute little bears in there. I'm also going to be using some Yupo paper. And this is basically a plastic paper. This is the one from Tim Holtz or Ranger, and I've just cut that down to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I've got 3 colors of alcohol inks. That's the dandelion, pistachio, and the coral, and that's actually the Key West combination of colors, so you can buy it in that pack of 3. I also have some watercolor paper, and this is the Kansan XL watercolor paper. And I've cut that down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches as well. And then the colors that I picked that were similar to the alcohol ink colors are cracked pistachio, abandoned coral, and mustard seed. So let's go ahead and get started on our first background. To make my first background, this is going to be using the Distress inks and the Kansan XL watercolor paper. All I've done is taken a piece of packaging. This is an old piece of packaging that I've cut down, and I just smushed the mustard seed ink right on to that piece of old packaging, and then I spritzed it with water, and then I tapped it down where I wanted it on my paper. This gives you a little bit more control doing it this way rather than just picking up the paper and squishing it down onto the ink. I'm going to do the same thing with the abandoned coral ink. This way, like I said, I have a little bit more control over where I put that ink, and I'm drying it in between with my heat tool to make sure that everything is good and dry. Next, I'm grabbing my cracked pistachio, and I'm doing the exact same thing with it, spritzing it with water, and then I will smush it down. And I do want to be a little bit careful as I place this down, because the cracked pistachio, when it mixes with the abandoned coral, can give you a brown. So I'm overlapping a little bit, but not too much. And that was really light, so I did go ahead and decide to do one more pass with the cracked pistachio after I had dried it. And I end up really liking the way that works out. So I did do another background, pretty much using the exact same technique, but moving the red and the yellow around. Now I'm going to move on to the alcohol inks. So I'm using that Yupo paper, which is basically just a plastic, and I've put a little bit of alcohol blending solution over the top of that, and now I'm grabbing the coral alcohol ink, and I put dabs of that down, and in between I'm grabbing the Distress marker spritzer. That way I can move those alcohol inks around. And then I will grab, so the next color was the dandelion, and now I'm using the pistachio. And I'm just spritzing those all over. And the nice thing about alcohol inks, or one of the nice things, is that when you set them down or when you get them on the Yupo paper, they kind of push the other stuff away that's around them. So it leaves this really neat effect. So then this right here, as you can tell, I'm just kind of tapping the color because I want little dots of it to just kind of to move around and just get a different effect. And I will do that with all 3 of those colors. And I love how this ends up turning out. And I will make one more just like this, pretty much. So that's fun. I really enjoyed making that one. And then there you can see the difference between the two. So now that our backgrounds are complete, it's time to work on our images. So I have a piece of Express It cardstock. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And I'm just going to line up my images from that Birthday Bears set that comes from My Favorite Things. I figure we have 4 backgrounds, so we can make 4 cards, and I'm not exactly sure how many of these bears I want, so I'm going to take all of the images in the set, and I'm going to stick those down onto that paper, and I am going to stamp them out. I'm going to stamp them out twice, actually, because like I said, with 4 cards, I wasn't sure which bears I wanted where, and I didn't see any problem with having extra bears for potential cards in the future. So I've got them all lined up. They fit pretty much perfectly onto that cardstock, which I have said before, Express It cardstock is my favorite for Copic Coloring. I do plan to do some Copic Coloring here. So I'm going to ink up my images with Memento Tuxedo black ink. It's Copic friendly, which means it won't bleed. It dries quickly, and so I can just Copic color right over the top, because Copics are alcohol-based markers. And they will spread or bleed into some inks. So this is why I choose the Memento. So I've stamped that out a couple times, and I'm going to grab one more piece of cardstock and I will stamp it out again so that I have extra images. And then we'll move on to the Copic coloring. For my Copic coloring, I have sped this up about 4 times, and I am starting off with all the bears, so it might seem a little boring because I'm just using browns for starters, and I have the E33 is what I started with, and then I'm going to go over the top of that with the E57. And like I said, it might seem a little bit boring, but I'm going to talk you through it. So I've got 3 tones, the E33, E57, and E29. And you noticed I started with the E33. That was my base color. I like to start with my lightest tones. I know some people like to go darkest to lightest, but I like to go lightest to darkest. I tend to use less marker when I do it this way. And so I started with my lightest tone so that I knew where I wanted my shading for all of that. And then I came back in with the E57, which was the second, my mid-tone. And I ended up going over a lot of the bear using that E57 because the blend would be easier from the tummy in if I did it this way, at least for me. And so for my third color, my darkest tone, I did use the E29. And if you notice, I sort of leave a round, like a little bit of a border of the lightest color when I'm doing round objects. That gives a tendency, or at least to the eye, it tells you that the object is rounded. So I tend to leave a little bit of a border of my mid-tone most of the time. And then I blend that out using my mid-tone as well. Moving on to this third bear, I thought I would keep him in as well simply because you see most of his tummy and you'll see a lot of the blending. The blending on the side bears was a lot easier, or the bears that are facing the side was a little bit easier just simply because there isn't a lot to try and blend out with that mid-tone to the light tone. And so I'm trying to keep his tummy fairly light, but I'm going back over in those spots using the dark, doing that same technique I was just telling you about where there's a rounded edge. I tend to leave a little bit of a border. And then I will go back over and blend those things out with the E57. You also notice that for these big bears, I didn't do color all three bears with the one color to start. If you do that, or at least if I do that, I find that the colors dry a little quickly, and then it's harder to blend them out. So if I do one at a time, I did for these small bears, I did do both of them because they're smaller images, so it wasn't as big of a deal. But for a big bear like those others, I didn't go and color all of them at once with the one color and then move on to the second color and do all the second color. I stuck to one bear, shading him and coloring him all so that I could make sure and get a good blend. And that's what works for me. I mean, you have to practice, you have to do what works for you, but I would definitely suggest practicing. If you're new to alcohol markers, that is just the way it's got to go. I have been coloring with alcohol markers for probably, well, since 2008, so it's been a good 11 years now. And so, you know, if I'm any good at it, which sometimes I don't think I am, but if I'm any good at it, it's because I've practiced. So don't lose heart, just practice. And practicing is fun, so keep it up. Now I'm moving on to the colors of the packaging, and I just chose the 3 similar colors that I had done for my backgrounds. So there was yellows, reds, and like pistachio green. And I wanted to be extremely careful with the green and the red, not because I was afraid of blending them, but I didn't want these to look like Christmas packages. So I didn't blend any of, or put any of the red with the green at all, as far as like ribbon and package. I made sure to keep it to yellows and reds, and then greens and yellows. And then I did color the other one off screen, so you don't see me coloring the other bit of bears. And I also cut them out, just fussy cutting, because I don't have the matching dies. I wish I did, but I don't. So I colored all these, cut them out, and that was that. I tried to use the R20 for the blush, but that was a waste. You couldn't see it on those dark bears. And then I do cover those with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. To stamp out my sentiments, I first put my Embossing Buddy powder bag all over some black cardstock that I had that's just in my stash. That is to keep embossing powder from sticking to places I don't want it. And then I inked up each of my sentiments using Versamark ink. This is just a sticky clear ink so that the embossing powder can stick to it. And I stamped each of those out. I'm not doing a great job of stamping them straight, but that's okay. I'm just going to cut them out straight when I get the opportunity. So now I'm covering those with the fine detail white embossing powder that I have. And as you can see, because I used that embossing bag, it keeps the powder from sticking to places that I didn't want it to stick to. The next step would be to heat this so that you can have your embossing powder melt. So you just want to heat it till it is smooth and melted. You don't want to go too much further past that. And you'll know that it is because it becomes shiny and it's no longer a matte. So I just check that in the light to make sure. Each of my card bases just came from my stash. These are each 4 1/4 by 11 inches that I'm scoring at 5 1/2 inches. And I've chosen 2 bright colors to go with the alcohol ink backgrounds and 2 more pastel colors to go with the ones that were the distress inks, because those were a little bit more subdued after they dried. And so I just got all those ready, and then I'm going to start adhering all of my pieces using some foam tape. And I do them all the exact same way, so I won't show you every bit that I do. But I do grab out my T-ruler so that I can get my sentiments on there fairly straight. And I did clip my banners to look like a fishtail. And then I flip those over and cut off all the excess. And then I take whatever bear that I had planned to put on, and I just peel off the backing paper from the foam tape, and then I'll stick those little babies down, and that one's ready to go. And the exact same thing for my distress backgrounds. So there you can see I'm clipping off a little bit of the edge, and I cut into the middle, and then I cut from the edges into that middle to get that fishtail. And then once again, I do it with that other one as well. And then those are all ready to be adhered after I've gotten all the foam tape on all of the images. Using my T-ruler once again to make sure everything is straight, I will stick that down, turn it over and trim off the excess, and then put down that little bear. Sorry, he's off screen here, but I'm just peeling off the backing paper. I'll stick him down, and then I'll peel off the backing paper from the balloon, and then I will use a little bit of liquid glue to adhere the bottom of the balloon to his little paw. Love that. And then for the inside of each of my cards, I do pick a coordinating sentiment that would go well. And for each of the pastel ones, it was the, I think Friends Make Life Bearable, or I Can't Bear to Be Without You. Just too darn cute. Yeah, Can't Bear to Be Without You. So I did that for both the light yellow and the like pistachio color. And then the darker ones were birthday cards. So I used the birthday sentiment for those. And then to adhere my card fronts to my card bases, I'm just using some liquid glue and going to adhere those down. And that liquid glue gives me just a little bit of wiggle room, excuse me, to make sure that all my fronts are on correctly and not crooked, because I do have a tendency to make things a little bit crooked. And then I did consider putting enamel dots or something on that, but at the end I just decided I loved those backgrounds and didn't want to cover them too much. So there's all 4 cards. You can tell which ones were the alcohol backgrounds and which one were the distress inks. If you liked this video, I'd love it if you hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and as always, thank you guys for stopping by.